April 1945. Berlin. A woman named Margaret Probst sat in the basement of her apartment building with 43 other civilians. They could hear the artillery getting closer. The Soviet Red Army was less than 2 miles away. Margaret was 26 years old. She kept a diary. In it, she wrote, "We don't talk about what we're afraid of. We all know. The younger women have cut their hair short and rubbed dirt on their faces. Some of the older women tell us it won't matter, that nothing will matter soon." What happened in the weeks and months that followed would affect millions of women across Eastern Germany, East Prussia, Silesia, and Poland. It would become one of the war's most documented yet least discussed tragedies. And for decades, both the Soviet Union and East Germany would deny it ever happened. This is not a simple story of victims and villains. This is a story about what happens when armies of traumatized, vengeful soldiers meet civilian populations, about how wartime propaganda creates monsters, about how women survive the unsurvivable, and about how entire societies choose to remember or forget what happened. The numbers are staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 860,000 and 2 million German women were assaulted by Soviet soldiers between January and May 1945, with the violence continuing into 1946 and beyond. But behind those numbers are individual stories of survival, resistance, collaboration, and the impossible choices women made to protect themselves and their families. This is what really happened. To understand what happened in 1945, we need to understand what came before. By January 1945, the Soviet Red Army had been fighting the Wehrmacht for 3.5 years. They had witnessed the complete destruction of their homeland. Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had killed an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Villages were burned with their inhabitants inside. Soviet prisoners of war were starved, frozen, and worked to death in German camps. The Soviet soldiers advancing into Germany in 1945 had seen things that defied comprehension. They had liberated the death camps. They had found mass graves. They had walked through destroyed Soviet villages where German soldiers had executed every living thing. Many of these soldiers carried letters from home describing atrocities against their own families. A tank commander named Alexander Levin wrote in his diary, "My sister was 17 when the Germans came to our village. They found her body in a ditch 3 months later. Now I'm in Germany, and I see their 17-year-old girls, and I remember my sister." Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman documented the army's mood as it crossed into Germany. He wrote, "The soldiers don't speak about revenge. They don't need to. It's in their eyes, in how they hold their weapons, and how they look at German civilians." But it wasn't just organic rage. Soviet propaganda had spent years dehumanizing Germans. Writer Ilya Ehrenberg published articles with phrases like, "break the racial pride of German women," and "the Germans are not human beings." Stalin's own son distributed pamphlets encouraging soldiers to take what they wanted from Germany. Soviet military leadership made a calculated decision. They would not restrain their troops when it came to German civilians. This wasn't official policy. There were orders against assault and looting, but those orders were rarely enforced. Commanders looked the other way. Political officers, whose job was to maintain discipline, sometimes participated. The Red Army that entered Germany in January 1945 was not the same army that had defended Moscow in 1941. It had been brutalized, traumatized, and transformed into an instrument of vengeance, and German women would pay the price. The violence began in the eastern territories before it reached Berlin. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, regions that had been part of Germany for centuries, were the first to experience the Red Army's advance. The German population had heard rumors. Nazi propaganda, in a twisted irony, had actually told the truth about some of the violence to come, though Germans had dismissed it as exaggeration designed to keep them fighting. When Soviet forces crossed the border into East Prussia in January 1945, hundreds of thousands of German civilians attempted to flee west. But winter and military chaos trapped many. What followed has been documented through survivor testimonies, Soviet soldier diaries, and post-war investigations. In the town of Nemmersdorf, Soviet troops killed German civilians and assaulted women ranging from 8 to 84 years old. When German forces briefly retook the town, they found and documented the scene. Nazi propaganda used these images, but the atrocities were real. Similar patterns emerged across the eastern territories. Soviet soldiers would enter a town or village, search for women, and assault them repeatedly. Age didn't matter. Appearance didn't matter. The assaults were about power, revenge, and the complete breakdown of military discipline. A survivor named Elizabeth Gruba, who was 16 in 1945, later testified. "They came to our farmhouse in groups, 3, 4, sometimes 7 soldiers. They didn't speak German. They didn't need to. They just pointed their guns. My mother tried to hide me in the cellar, but they found us. They assaulted my mother first while I watched. Then they assaulted me while she watched. That was the first time. There would be many more." The violence often followed a pattern. Soviet forward units, elite guards, and tank crews typically maintained better discipline, but follow-up troops, supply units, and freed Soviet prisoners of war who had been given uniforms and weapons were responsible for the worst atrocities. Alcohol played a massive role. Soviet soldiers discovered German alcohol stores and consumed massive quantities. A Russian lieutenant named Danil Zlatkin wrote in his memoir, "I saw men who were good soldiers, who had wives and children at home, become animals when drunk. They would do things sober they'd never do, then wake up and do them again." Women developed survival strategies. Some rubbed themselves with feces to smell repulsive. Others pretended to have typhus or other contagious diseases. Some elderly women volunteered themselves to protect younger women and girls. A few women disguised themselves as men, though this was risky if discovered. But the most common strategy was what survivors called choosing your wolf. A woman would attach herself to a single Soviet officer, becoming his temporary wife in exchange for protection from other soldiers. This was survival, not collaboration, though the distinction would blur in post-war judgment. Natalia Gesa, a Soviet war correspondent, witnessed the violence firsthand. She later wrote, "Women, mothers, and their daughters lie to the right and left along the streets, and before each of them stands a line of men with their trousers down. The women scream. Blood flows. Some are strangled to silence them. It happens during the day, in front of everyone. The death toll from these assaults is impossible to calculate. Some women were killed during the attacks. Others died from injuries afterward. Many committed suicide." In the East Prussian city of Königsberg, hospital records show an epidemic of suicide attempts among women in early 1945. By April 1945, the Red Army reached Berlin. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers surrounded the German capital. Inside were approximately 2.9 million civilians, roughly 2 million of whom were women. The Battle of Berlin lasted from April 16th to May 1945. During and after the battle, the violence against women reached its peak intensity. Anonyma, a journalist who kept a detailed diary, later published as A Woman in Berlin, documented the experience. She wrote, "It's not about lust. It's about showing us that we are conquered. that we are nothing. Some soldiers are brutal. Some are almost apologetic. It doesn't matter. The effect is the same. Berlin women faced particular challenges. Unlike rural areas where women could hide in forests or flee to neighboring towns, Berlin was surrounded. There was nowhere to go. Basements and bunkers that protected against bombs became traps where Soviet soldiers could find concentrations of women. The assaults in Berlin followed patterns. Soviet soldiers would go door to door or basement to basement, often in groups. They would assault women, then move to the next building. Some women were attacked dozens of times by different soldiers over weeks. Dr. Ingeborg Suchfort, who worked at a Berlin hospital in 1945, kept records. She later testified. In the first weeks after the Soviets arrived, we treated approximately 30 to 40 women per day for assault-related injuries. Many had internal injuries. Some had been assaulted by so many men they couldn't walk. Several were children under 12. 2 died in our care. The age range of victims was shocking. Soviet soldiers assaulted girls as young as 8 and women as old as 90. A survivor named Gerda Schneider recalled, "My grandmother was 76. She had trouble walking. They assaulted her anyway. She died 3 days later. I don't know if it was from the attack or from shame. She wouldn't speak after it happened." But Berlin also showed the complexity of the situation. Not all Soviet soldiers participated. Some actively protected German women. A few Soviet officers set up guards to prevent their men from assaulting civilians. These officers were in the minority, but their existence is documented. Captain Mikhail Koryakov wrote in his diary, "I court-martialed 3 of my men for assault. The political officer overruled me and released them within a day. He said they had earned the right to take revenge. I threatened to shoot the next man who touched a civilian. My men respected me enough to listen. Not all officers felt the same. Some German women found Soviet soldiers who protected them. These relationships were complicated, part necessity, part survival strategy, occasionally genuine affection. A woman named Ursula Gebhardt later described her Soviet protector. Sergei was a major. He claimed me as his woman, which meant other soldiers couldn't touch me. In exchange, I cooked for him, cleaned his quarters, and shared his bed. Was it rape? It felt like survival. He wasn't cruel. He was just there, and I needed protection. The city's infrastructure had collapsed. There was no running water, little electricity, and minimal food. Women who needed medical care after assaults often couldn't reach hospitals. Those who did reach hospitals found them overwhelmed and lacking supplies. Abortion became epidemic. Doctors performed thousands of illegal procedures on assault survivors who became pregnant. A gynecologist named Dr. Emma Schneider later estimated, "In my practice alone, I performed over 300 abortions between May and September 1945. Almost all were assault cases. We didn't have proper equipment or anesthesia. Some women died from complications. But they preferred that risk to carrying an enemy soldier's child." Suicide rates soared. The Berlin city records, incomplete as they are, show over 7,000 documented suicides among women between April and June 1945. The actual number was certainly higher. Women jumped from buildings, took poison, drowned themselves in the Spree River, or hanged themselves in their apartments. Churches filled with women seeking refuge. Many Soviet soldiers, coming from a communist state that had suppressed religion, were reluctant to enter churches. Priests and pastors protected as many women as they could. Pastor Martin Niemöller later wrote, "We turned our church into a sanctuary. We hid women in the crypts, in the bell tower, anywhere we could." Soviet soldiers still came, but less frequently than to regular buildings. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. But for German women in Soviet-occupied territories, the violence continued. The immediate post-war period brought no relief. Soviet occupation forces remained, and the assaults persisted, though at a somewhat reduced intensity. Women who had survived the initial chaos now faced months of continued occupation. The Soviet military administration attempted to impose order with mixed success. Marshal Georgy Zhukov issued orders against assault and looting in June 1945. Violators could theoretically be shot. In practice, enforcement was inconsistent. Some commanders prosecuted offenders. Others ignored the orders entirely. A major shift occurred as Soviet occupation troops were gradually replaced with more disciplined forces, and as officers gained better control. By late 1945, the frequency of assaults had decreased significantly, though they hadn't stopped. Women could walk streets with somewhat less fear, though the trauma remained. Pregnancy became a massive social crisis. Estimates suggest between 150,000 and 200,000 women became pregnant from assault. Most sought abortions. Those who couldn't obtain abortions or who gave birth faced terrible choices. Many babies were abandoned at hospitals or orphanages. These Russian children, as they were called, were often rejected by German society. Some mothers kept their children despite the stigma, loving them despite the circumstances of their conception. Others gave birth and immediately gave the babies up. A social worker named Kata Schmidt documented cases. I met a woman who had been assaulted by perhaps 20 different soldiers. She became pregnant and carried to term because abortion was unavailable. She gave birth to a son. She looked at him once and walked away. She never returned. I don't judge her. How could I? Disease spread rapidly. Sexually transmitted infections, particularly syphilis and gonorrhea, reached epidemic proportions among assault survivors. The medical infrastructure was inadequate to handle the crisis. Many women suffered permanent health consequences. Mental health impacts were profound and lasting. Women experienced what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. But in 1945, there was no trauma counseling, no therapy, no acknowledgement that they needed help. They were expected to simply continue living. Suicide continued at elevated rates throughout 1945. Some women who survived the initial violence couldn't cope with the aftermath: the pregnancy, the disease, the shame, the memories. They chose death months after the assaults ended. German society's response was complicated. In the immediate aftermath, there was community solidarity among women. They shared survival strategies, helped each other with abortions, protected each other's secrets. But as time passed and society tried to return to normal, a wall of silence descended. Women who spoke about what happened were often told to be quiet. The reasoning varied. Don't give the Soviets more propaganda material. Don't shame Germany further. Don't ruin your marriage prospects. Don't make others uncomfortable with your trauma. Men returning from prisoner of war camps faced a difficult reality. Their wives, daughters, sisters, and mothers had been assaulted while they were absent. Some men were compassionate and supportive. Others couldn't cope with the knowledge. Divorce rates spiked. Some men blamed the women, asking why they hadn't resisted more, hadn't died instead, hadn't somehow prevented what happened. A survivor named Helga Schneider described her husband's return. He came back from a POW camp in late 1945. I told him what had happened to me. He said he couldn't look at me the same way. He left within a week. I survived Soviet soldiers only to be abandoned by the man who promised to love me forever. The economic situation made everything worse. Germany was destroyed. Food was scarce. Employment was limited. Many women, particularly widows, or those whose husbands didn't return, resorted to transactional relationships with occupation soldiers, Soviet or later American, British or French, to obtain food, shelter, or protection. These fraternization relationships created a gray area that complicated the narrative. Were these women collaborators, prostitutes, or survivors doing what they needed to feed their children? The answer often depended on who was judging them. To fully understand what happened, we must examine the Soviet soldiers' perspective, not to excuse their actions, but to understand how ordinary men became capable of such violence. The Soviet soldiers who entered Germany weren't monsters by nature. They were men, many young, some teenagers, who had been shaped by years of brutal warfare and systematic dehumanization of the enemy. Lev Kopelev was a Soviet soldier and writer who witnessed the violence in East Prussia. He tried to stop it and was arrested for bourgeois humanitarianism. He later wrote, "These were men who had lost everything, their families, their homes, their innocence. Germany had destroyed their world, and now they stood in Germany with weapons and no supervision." The violence was predictable, even if it was unforgivable. Soviet propaganda had prepared soldiers to see Germans as less than human. Writer Ilya Ehrenberg's articles explicitly encouraged violence against German women as a form of revenge and racial dominance. While Ehrenberg later claimed his words were misunderstood, the damage was done. Many Soviet soldiers justified their actions through personal loss. They had photographs of destroyed homes, letters describing murdered family members, memories of atrocities witnessed. To them, assaulting German women was payback, an eye for an eye, suffering for suffering. A Soviet veteran named Vladimir Gelfand wrote in his diary, "I saw what the Germans did to our women. I saw the bodies. I heard the stories. When I see a German woman now, I feel rage. I feel entitled. They started this. We're finishing it." But not all Soviet soldiers participated. Some were horrified by their comrades' actions. Some tried to intervene and faced consequences. Some simply couldn't bring themselves to commit such violence, despite the peer pressure and opportunity. Grigory Chukrai, a Soviet soldier who later became a filmmaker, recalled, "I was ashamed of what I saw. Men I respected, men I'd fought beside, became rapists. When I tried to stop them, they called me weak. One officer told me, 'You're still thinking like a human. Think like a Russian with a dead family.' I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it." The role of alcohol cannot be overstated. Soviet soldiers consumed massive quantities of looted alcohol. Many assaults occurred while soldiers were heavily intoxicated. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it explains the intensity and repetitiveness of the violence. Drunk soldiers would assault women, pass out, wake up, and assault again. Group dynamics also played a crucial role. Men who might not have acted alone were swept up in group assaults. The presence of comrades, the desire to prove masculinity, the fear of being seen as weak, all contributed to participation in violence. There's evidence that younger, less experienced soldiers were more likely to commit assaults than veterans. Elite units with strong leadership had better discipline. Rear echelon troops, supply units, communication units, where discipline was laxer, had higher rates of assault. Some Soviet officers actively encouraged the violence as a reward for their troops. A German woman named Margaret Doss wrote in her diary about a Soviet officer who told her, "My men have fought from Stalingrad to Berlin. They've earned this. You should be grateful they're not killing you." Political officers, commissars, whose job was to maintain ideological discipline and monitor troops, had mixed responses. Some participated in assaults. Some ignored them. A few tried to stop them and were overruled by military commanders who didn't want to hurt morale. The Soviet military justice system theoretically prohibited assault. NKVD records show that some soldiers were prosecuted and even executed for assault, murder, and looting. But prosecutions were rare and inconsistent. For every soldier punished, hundreds or thousands committed similar acts without consequence. In the decades following World War II, what happened to German women in 1945 became one of history's most suppressed stories. Both East and West, both Soviet and German authorities, had reasons to bury the truth. The Soviet Union denied it happened. Official Soviet history portrayed the Red Army as liberators who brought freedom and justice to Europe. Any suggestion that Soviet soldiers committed atrocities was dismissed as Nazi propaganda or Western anti-Soviet lies. Soviet veterans who tried to discuss what they witnessed faced censorship or worse. Lev Kopelev spent years in the Gulag, partly for criticizing Red Army behavior in Germany. Other writers and historians who mentioned the violence saw their work banned. East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union, also suppressed discussion. The East German government relied on Soviet support and couldn't acknowledge that its protector had brutalized its population. Women who spoke about their experiences were told they were undermining socialist solidarity. An East German woman named Ingrid Müller recalled, "In the 1950s, I tried to talk about what happened to me. Party officials visited me and told me I was spreading fascist propaganda. They threatened to take away my housing and my job. I never spoke of it again until after reunification." West Germany had different reasons for silence. The new Federal Republic was trying to rebuild its image and integrate into Western Europe. Drawing attention to Soviet atrocities risked several things: appearing to deflect from Nazi crimes, increasing Cold War tensions, and forcing German society to confront trauma it wanted to forget. German men, particularly those who had served in the Wehrmacht, often couldn't cope with what had happened to their women while they were fighting or imprisoned. Discussing it meant confronting their own failure to protect their families. Many preferred to simply not talk about it. Women themselves often chose silence. They faced shame, judgment, and the risk of destroying their marriages or family relationships. Many women never told their husbands, their children, or even their closest friends what happened to them. A survivor named Elizabeth Heinemann explained, "I never told my husband. I never told my children. They knew something had happened. Everyone knew something had happened. But we didn't discuss details. When I see my grandchildren, I think about telling them. So history isn't forgotten. But then I think, what would be the point? It would only hurt them." The few attempts to document what happened faced enormous obstacles. When A Woman in Berlin was first published in 1954, it was met with hostility in Germany. Critics called the author a whore and a traitor. The book was withdrawn and not republished in German until 2003. Historians who researched the topic faced accusations of minimizing Nazi crimes or promoting Cold War anti-Soviet propaganda. The topic was so politically charged that serious academic research was difficult until after the Cold War ended. Churches, which had provided sanctuary during the violence, also largely remained silent. Catholic and Protestant church leaders in Germany didn't want to antagonize either the Soviet Union in the East or their own congregations in the West by dwelling on the trauma. Medical records that could have documented the scope of the violence were often destroyed, lost, or suppressed. Hospital administrators in both East and West Germany had incentives to make records disappear. The women themselves aged, died, and took their stories with them. By the time German reunification in 1990 made it safer to discuss what happened, many survivors had passed away. Those who remained were elderly and often reluctant to revisit trauma from 45 years earlier. Despite decades of suppression, the story of what happened to German women in 1945 eventually emerged through multiple sources that, taken together, provide overwhelming evidence. Diaries written during the events provided the most immediate documentation. A Woman in Berlin by Anonyma is the most famous, but dozens of other diaries survived. Women wrote in secret, often hiding their journals from soldiers and later from husbands and authorities. These diaries share common themes: the daily terror, the survival strategies, the physical and emotional toll, and the strange normalcy that women tried to maintain amid horror. They document not just assaults, but also the small acts of kindness, the moments of dark humor, the determination to survive. Soviet soldiers also kept diaries, though fewer survived. Those that did provide confirmation from the perpetrator's perspective. Soldiers wrote matter-of-factly about violence that shocked later readers. These diaries show that what happened was common knowledge within the Red Army. Medical records, where they survived, provide statistical evidence. Hospital admission records, abortion records, suicide statistics, and disease tracking data all paint a picture of massive sexual violence. Dr. Philip Kuert's research team in the 2000s analyzed surviving medical documents and found evidence consistent with the historical accounts. Church records documented baptisms, burials, and sanctuary activities. Priests and pastors who provided refuge to women sometimes kept records of what they witnessed. These records were often more candid than official documents because they weren't subject to government censorship. Post-war surveys and studies, though limited, captured some data. American and British occupation authorities in Western zones conducted investigations into conditions in Soviet-occupied territories. These reports documented refugee testimonies and provided early evidence of what had occurred. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened archives that had been closed for decades. Researchers gained access to Soviet military records, NKVD reports, and other documents that confirmed the scale of the violence. These archives showed that Soviet leadership knew what was happening and largely chose to ignore it. Oral history projects in reunified Germany collected survivor testimonies. Organizations like the German Historical Museum and various regional archives interviewed elderly women who were finally willing to tell their stories. These interviews, conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, preserved accounts before the witnesses died. Academic historians, particularly Norman Naimark, The Russians in Germany, Antony Beevor, Berlin, The Downfall 1945, and others, synthesized available evidence into comprehensive accounts. Their work established what happened as documented historical fact, rather than rumor or propaganda. Demographic studies provided statistical backing. Researchers analyzed birth records, noting spikes in births 9 months after Soviet occupation, along with corresponding spikes in abortion records and infant abandonment. Population studies tracked suicide rates and found they were dramatically elevated among women of certain ages in occupied zones. The evidence became so overwhelming that even Russian historians began acknowledging what happened. Some Russian scholars, examining their own archives, confirmed that Red Army soldiers committed widespread sexual violence in Germany. This acknowledgement wasn't universal in Russia. Many Russians still view discussion of Red Army crimes as Western attempts to rehabilitate Nazism or diminish Soviet sacrifices. But the historical consensus in the West is clear. What happened to German women in 1945 was real, widespread, and devastating. The violence of 1945 didn't end when the soldiers left. Its consequences rippled through generations, affecting not just the women who experienced it, but their families and German society as a whole. Physical health consequences were severe and lasting. Many women suffered permanent internal injuries from repeated assaults. Infections, some untreated for lack of medical care, caused chronic pain, and disability. Women who contracted sexually transmitted diseases often lived with them for years before effective treatments became available. Reproductive health was devastated. Multiple forced abortions performed without proper medical care left many women unable to have children later. Some women who gave birth to children conceived through assault faced complicated feelings toward those children, loving them while being reminded of trauma. A woman named Gerda Bechmann kept the child she bore from assault. She later said, "I looked at my daughter and saw both the worst moment of my life and the best thing that ever happened to me. She was innocent. She didn't ask to be born this way. But sometimes, when she smiled, I saw the face of one of the soldiers, and I had to leave the room." Mental health impacts were profound and often unaddressed. PTSD, though not diagnosed as such at the time, affected countless survivors. Depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation persisted for decades. Without modern trauma therapy, women developed their own coping mechanisms, many of them unhealthy. Substance abuse became common among survivors. Alcohol helped numb the memories. Prescription drugs, when available, were misused. Some women became dependent on medications that barely existed in post-war Germany. Relationships suffered enormously. Many survivors couldn't maintain intimate relationships. Marriage became difficult or impossible. The trauma of forced sexual contact made consensual intimacy challenging. Divorce rates among assault survivors were significantly higher than among women who hadn't experienced such violence. Children of survivors often grew up in homes shadowed by unspoken trauma. Mothers who couldn't discuss what happened to them still carried the weight of it. Children sensed something was wrong, but didn't understand what. This unexplained tension affected family dynamics for decades. Some survivors became fiercely protective of their daughters, restricting their freedom out of fear that history would repeat itself. Others went the opposite direction, becoming emotionally distant as a defense mechanism. Either approach created challenges for the next generation. Economic consequences were significant. Women who became pregnant from assault and kept their children often faced poverty as single mothers in a society that stigmatized them. Women whose health was damaged by the violence struggled to work and support themselves. Social stigma followed survivors throughout their lives. Even in cases where a woman's experience was known to her community, it was rarely discussed openly. The shame attached to assault meant that women carried not just the trauma, but also social judgment. Trust in authority and institutions eroded. Women who had been failed by their government, their military, and often their own families developed deep skepticism about institutions. This mistrust sometimes extended to their children, affecting their worldview and politics. The scale of the trauma influenced German culture in subtle ways. Post-war German literature, film, and art contain undercurrents of this collective trauma, even when not explicitly addressed. The experience shaped how Germany thought about military occupation, foreign soldiers, and women's safety. Survivor networks formed, though often informally and secretly. Women who had been through the same experiences sometimes found each other and provided mutual support. These connections were lifelines for some survivors, though many women remained completely isolated with their trauma. As survivors aged, some found peace through various means. Therapy, when it finally became available and destigmatized. Religious faith. Activism and speaking out. Creative expression. Others never found peace and carried the trauma to their graves. Today, what happened to German women in 1945 is acknowledged as historical fact. Memorials exist. Books have been written. Survivors who lived into the 21st century were able to tell their stories before they died. But important questions remain. How do we remember this tragedy in context? The women who suffered were innocent civilians, but they were also citizens of a nation that had committed unprecedented crimes. Does one fact diminish the other? Most historians say no. Civilians are not responsible for their government's crimes, and what happened to German women doesn't minimize Nazi atrocities. It's simply another chapter in the catastrophic human cost of World War II. The story teaches us about the dangers of dehumanizing propaganda, the breakdown of military discipline in revenge-driven warfare, and the ways societies suppress uncomfortable truths. It reminds us that war's consequences extend far beyond battlefields, and that women and children often pay the highest prices for conflicts they didn't start. For the Soviet Union, acknowledging what happened requires confronting a complicated legacy. The Red Army saved Europe from Nazism at tremendous cost. Soviet soldiers were also human beings, who sometimes behaved inhumanely. Both things are true. For Germany, the story is part of a larger reckoning with World War II's legacy. Germans simultaneously acknowledge their nation's crimes while recognizing that German civilians suffered too. This balance is delicate but necessary for honest historical accounting. The survivors are almost all gone now. The last women who experienced 1945 are in their 90s if they're still alive. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers firsthand. That makes documentation and education more important than ever. What happened to German women in 1945 was real. It was widespread. It was devastating. And it matters that we remember, not to assign blame or keep score, but to understand the full human cost of war and to ensure that future generations learn from the past. The women who survived did so with remarkable resilience. They rebuilt their lives, raised families, contributed to Germany's reconstruction, and carried their trauma with dignity. Their stories deserve to be told, not as propaganda for any side, but as testimony to human endurance in the face of unimaginable horror. This was what really happened to German women after Soviet soldiers arrived in 1945.